Okay, in this video, we're not going to do anything too crazy, too complicated. There's no maths or graphs, anything in this topic. We're just going to discuss debt and deficits, and this is going to be more topical and conceptual than anything else. So the first thing we need to do is just define a few things. So the first two terms are deficit and surplus. And these are going to be two terms that we use to describe what's going on in a single year. So in any one year, we look at how much tax revenue the government collects, and then we compare that to how much money the government spends. So we're comparing the spending and taxing of the government. So in a year in which we spend more than we bring in tax revenue, so when our spending exceeds our revenue, we say we are experiencing a budget deficit. That means we're trying to spend more money than we have. Alternatively, we may be spending less than we bring in revenue. So our revenue exceeds our expenditures, and in that case we have a budget surplus. So a budget deficit is when we don't have enough money, and a budget surplus is when we end up with extra money. Now, we do that on an annual basis. We just compare the two numbers. We say it's either a deficit or it's a surplus, or in some cases, maybe our spending is exactly equal to our revenue, in which case we say we have a balanced budget, neither a deficit nor a surplus. Now, the question is what's happening in the long run? And that's when we turn to the term debt or public debt. So in years in which we have a budget deficit, that suggests we need to borrow money to cover all of our expenses. In other years in which we have a surplus, we may be able to use those extra dollars to pay back what we borrowed in a previous time period. And so that public debt is simply the accumulation of all past deficits and surpluses up to a given point in time. So every year we have a deficit, it increases the public debt or the national debt. And every year in which we have a budget surplus, it could potentially lead to a decrease in the public debt as we pay off some of that debt. And then in a year in which we have a balanced budget, the national debt would neither increase nor decrease, with the exception of any interest that's accruing on what we've borrowed. Now, once we've calculated this and we've been tracking it over time, there's two ways we can think about what that number represents. And the first way to look at it is just the total public debt. So this is the total debt that our national government owes. This doesn't take into consideration what you or I or households or firms owe. We're talking about what the government owes. So the total national debt is a great big number. And obviously the bigger the number, the more concern it's going to be. So for example, the United States currently has a national debt of roughly $18 trillion, I think. It's a big number. But what's more important than just looking at that number by itself is looking at whether or not we're going to be able to pay it off in the future. And since this is debt that the government, that society has accumulated for itself, that means that government, or society acting through its government, is going to be responsible for paying it back. Well, if government is having to pay for it, that means government is going to be relying on tax revenue to make those payments in the future. And of course, we know that the government collects tax revenue based on how well the economy is doing. So if the economy is doing really well, that means that we're earning higher incomes. We're maybe paying, more taxes, absolutely, but we're also maybe bumping up into higher tax brackets. Because of that progressive income tax. It means firms are earning more revenues, and so they're paying more taxes. So when the economy is growing, when GDP is rising, tax revenue is going to go up, and that's going to make it easier for the government to get to first a balanced budget, and then a surplus, and then use those surplus dollars to pay down the debt. Now, of course, that means that during a recession, when the economy is contracting or shrinking, the government's not going to be able to collect as much tax revenue, and so that means it's going to be tougher to start making payments on that debt. And so what we do then, with this in mind, is we look at what we call the debt to GDP ratio. And so you can think of it like for a household. You might think of a household that has $50,000 in debt from cars or credit cards or whatever, and then that household, maybe they have a household income of $150,000. So if you take that debt, the $50,000, to the household income, $150,000, right? That's a 50 to 150 ratio. That $150,000 in income, is much greater than the household debt, which suggests that that household will be able to, make some progress on paying off the debt. Whereas a household that has $50,000 in debt but only has maybe $40,000 in household income, well, obviously they owe more money than they currently earn, and so it's going to be very difficult to make payments on that debt. And so it's going to be the same for a country with its national debt. The United States has a large public debt, but we also have a very large GDP, and more years than not, that GDP is growing. Other countries, they may have a lower debt to GDP ratio, meaning they haven't acquired as much debt or they have a much larger or faster growing economy. Other countries, it's the exact opposite. They have a very high debt, a high level of debt, but not a very large economy or an economy that's not growing very quickly. And so, what we want to do is compare not just how much we owe, but our ability to grow the economy, to generate tax revenue so that the government can pay off that debt. Now, in years when a government is experiencing a budget deficit, when it needs to spend more dollars than it brings in revenue, we've got to figure out a way to close that gap. In other words, we've got to figure out a way to finance the deficit. And the first way that government finances its spending is by borrowing. So just like a household or a firm borrows to either buy a house or a car or to invest in their company, the government, the federal government, or city and state governments can borrow money. And when government borrows money, what we say is happening is that they are selling or issuing bonds, B-O-N-D. Now, a bond is simply an IOU. It's a loan. And so the government writes up all of these bonds, and it sells them to a number of different groups of people, and in return they get money. So they're selling the bond in exchange for money, and then they use that money to cover their government expenses, to pay for government public goods and services. And then in the future, they will pay back the people who bought the bonds. They will pay back the people they borrowed from. Now, in the United States, the first place that our federal government goes to borrow is actually the Federal Reserve, which we'll talk about in the next lesson. You can think of that as the central bank of the United States. So it's the Federal Reserve, but also other federal agencies. So in a sense, you have part of the government, the U.S. Treasury, borrowing from other parts of the federal government. Now this sounds kind of funny, but there's actually parts of the federal government that have their own special source of revenue. This means that they receive these tax dollars or these fees or fines or payments, and they're the only ones that can spend them. So the biggest example of this is Social Security. So when we earn a paycheck, we pay our income tax, but then we also pay that payroll tax, that 7.65% that goes to fund both Social Security and Medicare. So that means the Social Security Administration is going to be receiving these dollars from our payroll tax, and it can only spend those dollars on Social Security checks to grandma and grandpa, to old, disabled, retired people. And so what that means is that sometimes the Social Security Administration is collecting more dollars in the payroll tax than it's paying to grandma and grandpa, which means they have extra dollars left over at the end of the day. Now, usually when people have savings, they'd like to invest it, right? Invest it in stocks or mutual funds to try and earn even more money. But this is Social Security money we're talking about, and we don't necessarily want to risk grandma and grandpa's Social Security on the stock market. But what the Social Security Administration is allowed to do is use its extra dollars to purchase government bonds. In other words, the Social Security Administration is loaning money to the rest of the federal government. And so that means the federal government is going to be paying back money into the Social Security Fund and then also paying back money to the Federal Reserve. Now, once it goes beyond the Federal Reserve and other federal agencies, the federal government can turn to the public. And so it can purchase or it can sell bonds to individual people. So you can walk into a bank today and purchase a U.S. government bond. Some of you may have bonds at home. Perhaps your grandma or grandpa bought you a bond, a U.S. savings bond, when you were born. And so that means that you, in effect, own a government bond and the government owes you money. Firms, businesses can also buy bonds. They can also loan money to the government. And in particular, banks. And as we've talked about banks already, banks are in the business of making loans to generate interest. And so banks loan you and me money to go out and buy a house and a car. But then banks can also buy bonds from the government, in other words, loaning money to the federal government. So the federal government, they go to the Federal Reserve and other federal agencies first, and then they go to the American public, so American citizens and businesses and banks. But then the federal government can also end up selling bonds to people outside of the United States, so foreign citizens, foreign companies, in some cases foreign governments. There's really no end to where a bond might end up. Maybe I buy a bond or I sell a bond. Let's see, I buy a bond from the government. I loan the government money, and they're going to be paying me over time. But maybe I want to get my money back now, Well, I can't force the government to pay me back now, so maybe I sell the bond to someone else in another country. So we've got the overall national debt. A big chunk of it, between 30 and 40%, is owed to other parts of the federal government, the Federal Reserve and other federal agencies. That means the other 60, 70% is what we call debt held by the public. So that means anyone outside of the government. And of that debt held by the public, about 50% of it, about half, is owed to the American public, so American citizens and businesses and banks. And then the other half is owed to foreign entities, so foreign citizens, banks, businesses. Now, obviously, we don't think of debt as a good thing, and so in some cases, when we are experiencing perhaps a budget deficit, we may want to try to balance the budget. And so what that means, recall, when you have a deficit, it means that you're spending more dollars than you're bringing in revenue. And so if you want to bring that budget back into balance, you're either going to have to cut your spending, or you're going to have to find a way to increase your tax revenue. And so when we go about this balancing, there's actually two approaches we can take. The first approach is the annual approach. And that simply means that every single year, every budget year, we say, here's how much tax revenue we expect to bring in, and we are going to limit ourselves to spending no more than we bring in tax revenue. So we're going to commit to spending within our means. This is what we expect of households and firms. Don't spend more money than you make. It makes sense, right? So why not have the government do the same thing? Well, it turns out that city and state governments are actually required to do this. So for example, in the state constitution, it requires the state of Texas to balance its budget every year. So the governor and the state legislature, they make predictions about what tax revenue will be, and then they build a budget based on that. Now, it's no easy task, but oftentimes you'll hear elected officials at the state level saying, "Oh, we balanced the budget," which is good, right? The government's living within its means, but again, they don't really have a choice because it's in the Constitution. It's in the state constitution saying you have to balance the budget, and it's the same for cities and counties. So from the state governments on down, government has to balance its budget every single year. Now the problem with that is what happens during a recession. So think about it. During a recession, the economy shrinks, it contracts. And what's going to happen as a result is that tax revenue is going to fall. So if you think about, during a recession, people are spending less money. That means that state and local governments are earning less in sales tax. Well, if a state or local government starts to see a decrease in its tax revenue and it has to balance its budget, well, then the only option is to cut its spending. Because you're probably not going to want to be the governor or the mayor that raises taxes during a recession. And so this is exactly what we see happening during recessions, especially in 2008, 2009, was government tax revenues fell at the federal level, the state level, and the city level. And at the state and local level, governments started cutting their spending. Well, recall from our discussion of fiscal policy that when government cuts its spending, that can be seen as a form of contractionary fiscal policy. And the result of contractionary fiscal policy is that you get economic contraction. Well, what started this off? Well, we were in a recession. That led to lower tax revenue. That forced the government to cut its spending, which then pushes us even deeper into a recession. And so in cities and states around the country, this is exactly what we saw in 2008 and 2009, was these local and state governments forced to cut their budgets, actually ended up making their local recessions even worse. And if you think about it, it's not just the fact that the local government is spending less, buying stuff from businesses and firms, but in some cases, at a city level, maybe they have to cut down on their police force, or maybe the local school district has to lay off some teachers. Well, those police officers and those teachers, they're households. Those are people, and now they have less income or no income. And when households have less income, they can't spend as much, and so it just starts to enter this downward spiral. So an annual approach to balancing the budget, it may sound like a good idea, but when we require a government to balance its budget, even during times of recession, it can have the unintended consequence of making the recession worse. Now, at the federal level, our federal government is not required to balance its budget. And so in theory, what we can say is that the federal government is following an annual approach. It's not balancing the budget every single year. It's following what we call a cyclical approach. And so this means that the federal budget will go back and forth between deficits and surpluses as the economy goes through its business cycle. So when the economy enters a contraction or goes into recession, tax revenues will fall, but the federal government can continue to spend money, which means it will experience a deficit, which means it has to borrow money in order to keep spending, to keep providing public goods and services, and eventually, hopefully, that will help the economy get back on track. All right, and then as the economy grows and it gets back into expansion, government, maybe it cuts back on its spending a little bit because the economy is doing better, but then tax revenue is also going to start to rise as firms and households, spend more and earn more. And it may get to a point during that expansion that the government can start to run a budget surplus. And remember, that's when tax revenue exceeds spending, so that means the government ends up with extra dollars, and then they can use those extra dollars to pay back the money that they borrowed when they were running a budget deficit during the recession. So when the economy is doing bad, the government runs a deficit, it borrows money, and then when the economy is doing well, the government doesn't have to borrow money. It maybe ends up with extra money, and then it uses that extra money to pay back what it borrowed. So it'd be like a household. Maybe a household borrows a lot of money to buy a car this year, which means they go into debt. But then as they keep working and they keep earning income, eventually they start to make car payments, and maybe one year they have a really good year, right, on the job, and they make a lot of extra money, and then they can just completely pay off the car loan. It's the same kind of process for the federal government. So the question is, does our federal government actually follow this cyclical approach? Well, we have more years of economic growth than we have years of recession, right? It's more likely that we're in a period of growth than contraction. So what that suggests is that it should be, that's a normative, right, statement, it should be that the government is going to be in better financial shape, and it's more likely to experience, if not a surplus, at least a balanced budget. All right. So in theory, when there's more years of growth, government finances are closer to a balanced or surplus, which means that we should get a handle on our debt. But then we look at the data or the other facts, and we see that, oh no, the United States has a lot of debt. What that means is that we're running deficits not just in times of recession, but our federal government is even running deficits in times of expansion. Okay. So cyclical approach, it works in theory, but in practice is another story. Now, there's a couple of other things about government spending and taxation that are going to automatically lead to surpluses and deficits, perhaps, if not a balanced budget. And these are our automatic stabilizers. And so these are things that are going to kick in automatically as the economy goes through its business cycle. So one of these is our progressive income tax. During a recession, when the economy is shrinking, we as households earn less income. And so we're going to pay less tax, but we're also going to end up paying a lower tax rate because we get bumped down into a lower income tax bracket. Well, that's obviously going to lead to less tax revenue for the government. On top of that, there's another automatic stabilizer that we've mentioned, and that's our transfer payments. So this is things like Medicare and Medicaid and unemployment benefits and welfare. Well, during a recession, more people become unemployed or they become low income, and so they qualify for things like unemployment and welfare, which means government spending automatically increases during a recession due to these increased transfer payments. So you've got increase in transfer payments automatically, you've got lower tax revenue because of the progressive income tax, which means that there's going to be this almost automatic deficit at the federal level. And this is not even taking into consideration, any discretionary changes in spending and taxing that the federal government might do as part of its fiscal policy. Now, on the other hand, when the economy is growing, when it's becoming perhaps overheated or prices are starting to get too high, when the economy is doing better, that means people are going to be earning more income, and so they're going to get bumped up into higher tax brackets, and so this means they'll be paying a slightly higher tax rate, and that means that there's more tax revenue being generated by the government, and they're not going to spend too much. They'll still be able to grow the economy, but not too much, so we avoid some inflation. And at the same time, the transfer payment spending is going to go down because when the economy is doing better, that means there are fewer people that are unemployed, there are fewer people on welfare, and so that form of government spending automatically goes down. So during expansion, you've got increased government revenue, but decrease in transfer payment spending, and so that's going to get us closer and closer to a balanced budget and then perhaps a budget surplus. Now, few final thoughts or things to consider about debt. There are some long-term concerns we have about debt, for sure. And one of the most common you hear is that when we run deficits today and we borrow money today and we pile more money onto the debt, well, eventually future generations are going to be responsible for paying off that debt. And if you think about it, it's kind of unfair because we're borrowing today. That means our government is providing us with public goods and services today, so we're benefiting from the borrowing. But then future generations are going to have to pay it off. And that means that in order to pay it off, the government is going to have to find a way to run budget surpluses. Well, the only way you can run a budget surplus is if you start collecting more tax revenue or raising the tax rate, or if you start cutting back on government spending. So that means future generations are going to be paying higher taxes, receiving less in government spending in the form of public goods and services. So they're actually going to, be on the losing end of that. So as we continue to add to the debt, we're simply kicking the can down the road, and that means future generations will have to pay for the borrowing of, current or previous generations. And this is what we call the intergenerational effect. One generation, impacting another generation. Now, another concern is what we call the distributional effect. And so this comes into play when we actually start paying taxes and paying down the debt. So recall that this is debt that our government owes. This is what we as a society owe. We've elected officials that have made decisions that has resulted in debt, and so we as a society are going to have to pay it back. Now, everybody in theory pays taxes in some form, whether it's federal, state, or local. At the federal level, everybody pays income taxes up, above a certain amount of income. And what that means is that if everybody's paying in, right, it doesn't matter whether you're rich or you're poor, you're paying taxes to the federal government so the federal government can pay off its debt. But now we've got to consider, well, who is getting paid back, right? Who bought those bonds from the government? Who does the government owe money to? Well, it owes money to everybody, right? It owes money to American citizens and firms and banks and foreigners and the Federal Reserve and everybody. But a lot of those dollars, a lot of that debt is going to be owed to larger corporations, larger businesses, larger banks, wealthier individuals, right? They're the ones that had the money to loan to the government in the first place, which means they're the ones that are going to be receiving a majority of those debt payments. And so what we get is an effect that is a regressive redistribution of wealth, because everybody is paying taxes to the government, right? Rich or poor alike, everybody in between. But then most of those taxes that are being used to pay off the debt are going to flow back to wealthier individuals and wealthier banks and businesses. And so this is kind of the opposite of a Robin Hood effect, right? A progressive income tax or a progressive redistribution means that, we ask people with more money or higher incomes to contribute a little bit more so that we can provide, public goods and services and assistance to lower income people. That's a progressive redistribution. And this is a regressive. It's the opposite. It's reverse Robin Hood. It'd be like Robin Hood stealing from the poor and giving to the rich. And so that's something we've also got to consider, is that as we accumulate more debt, eventually it's going to have to be paid back, possibly by future generations. But then there's also going to be this distributional impact where everybody pays and relatively wealthier individuals and entities collect those funds. Now the last one is the international effect. And so at the end of the day, some of the debt that we pay back is going to go to people outside of the country. And so that means there's going to be dollars flowing outside of our domestic circular flow. Now that might sound like a bad thing at first, but then you've got to remember, well, what are dollars good for? Well, it turns out people use dollars to buy American goods and services. And so as we pay back foreign entities and foreign people and foreign businesses, they may use those dollars they receive and buy American goods and services, which is going to be a net, possibly a gain for our economy. Or they may take those dollars and invest in American assets like stocks or commercial real estate, which helps to grow our economy. Or in some cases, those foreigners may get paid back, and then they turn around and they loan those dollars right back to the government. But we've got to keep in mind that there is going to be this international flow of dollars in and out. Now, the final thing to consider is, well, does this mean that, debt is bad? Is a budget deficit a bad thing? And, that word bad is very normative, right? Whether something is good or bad is, a matter of opinion. And for an economist, the question is not so much whether it's just all bad or all good, but if we're borrowing dollars, why? What is the point of borrowing? What are we going to be doing with those borrowed dollars? Well, let's say we're in a recession. And tax revenue goes down, but the government wants to keep providing public goods and services, and it wants to conduct expansionary fiscal policy. Well, in that case, government borrowing, right, accumulating debt, might not be a such bad thing if it's going to help get the economy out of a recession. Or maybe the government is borrowing some money today so that it can spend that money to fix roads and bridges, or build better schools, or invest in research and development. Well, if we're borrowing to pay for those things are going to pay off in the long run, right? So those are some of the factors that lead to long run growth. So it may not necessarily be a bad thing to borrow and invest in public infrastructure and education. It's kind of like college students borrowing money to pay for college. You're borrowing to acquire an education that's going to make you better off in the long run. So same for government. It's a form of public investment, and it may not necessarily be a bad thing in the long run. But in some cases, a government may borrow money not to achieve some long run growth, but just to keep the lights on, right? Maybe government is just not bringing in enough money just to keep government up and running on a daily basis. And in that case, they borrow, and that's just accumulating more debt. And that doesn't necessarily, make the government or the society better off in the long run. Or maybe the government has borrowed so much money, right? We as a society are so deep in debt that we have to borrow money from one person to pay back the money we borrowed from another person. So there's a lot of different reasons that societies, accumulate debt, that governments borrow money, and the question that we have to ask at the end of the day is that money being well spent? Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, sometimes it's hard to say. So that concludes the lecture on debt and deficits. I know this is a long video, but this was hopefully nothing too stressful, no graphs, no math or anything, just a lot of concepts and key ideas and topics. And so please let me know if you have any questions.